Patricia Gundlach here. Welcome back. Tom's got some really good insight on this one. You did the business when the studios were running the whole deal.
The studios and the networks.
How would you compare that to what goes on today?
Well, one of the ways that it's changed, as I mentioned, it's become more corporatized. But on a practical level, one of the gifts we had was that you generally pitched to one person. And that one person could make the decision, yes or no, he had the authority. And as often as not, I'd go in and pitch an idea for a series or a movie and walk out with a script deal. Mm-hmm. Or worst case, maybe you have to wait 2 days for an answer, yes or no. And my feeling was if it was a no, it wasn't the last idea I was going to have. I was making stuff up as I was driving into the parking structure anyway. I didn't sweat my pitches ahead of time. Mm-hmm. And it was very conversational. And of course, you know, you have to understand, if they're willing to take those meetings with you, it's because they bought your act. It's a confidence game. You, the creative person, are trying to inspire the confidence in that other person to part with his money or his company's money. I was lucky enough to be credible with all of the networks and all the studios and could go in and pitch an idea one-on-one. Today, I have a showrunner friend, current showrunner friend, who pitches, you know, like to ABC, and he's pitching to 7 people. And that's a whole different psychology. It's not impossible. Wisdom doesn't get transferred to the next generation of executives. So they will still buy the same unworkable series. For a period, I was perceived, and how you're perceived is so important. I was perceived as a guy who could fix series that were in trouble. I never said I could do it, but they decided that I could, and all of a sudden, in one 3 or 4 year or 3-year period, I was on something like 11 different series. In those days, instead of canceling the series if it was, you know, low ratings the first 4 or 5 episodes, they'd fire the writers and they'd hire me and another guy to try and save it. I was never able to save any of them because the concepts were all no good to begin with. Those concepts, for instance, a reporter who solves crimes, they still buy those series, even though it's unworkable. And it's unworkable because the audience doesn't believe it, and because the reality is a cop would say, "You're a reporter, get the hell out of my way," period. You can do it in a movie. You can do it in China Syndrome. But that's a one-shot. To try to make a series out of that means that this reporter is not doing his or her job every week. He's doing the cop's job. There is always a requirement of, you know, suspension of disbelief, as with Jessica Fletcher in Murder, She Wrote, who just happened to be in the vicinity of 264 murders over 12 years.
She's a busy girl.
We used to joke around the studio that she was the angel of death.
So it's basically, it used to be where you just had to convince the judge, and now you've got a jury.
Now you got a jury. That's very well put. And yeah, I think that's one of the tougher parts. And so there's a lot more fear of failure at the corporate level than there was. And understandably so, because, you know, when I got into it, there were still only 3 networks at the beginning of my career. NBC, ABC, and CBS in television. That was the whole game. And of course, before I was finished, there were first one syndication, and, you know, this explosion of channels. Back when I started, the biggest cities only had 11 channels or 12 channels. And now, of course, there are hundreds of choices, and people's attention is fragmented, and they jump around, and so it's a whole other game. And man, if you can hook an audience for a series now, you're really doing a job.
Would you say it's easier to write a movie than a television series?
I think today it is. The problem is that the people who are making the movies, most of them wouldn't recognize a good script if it came and bit them. the crap that gets made these days is breathtaking. The amount of it and the ineptitude of it. That's a whole other phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. Would you recommend stick with movies, TV?
Well, it seems to me that TV is an easier market still, because they use up material so fast.
Now, what about just for the art if you want to do plays?
Well, plays, that's a whole other thing. I mean, my only venture into that was I was inspired some years ago to write an opera about Jack Kennedy. And it was just a brainstorm one day in 1982. Holly and I went to see a Vita, and when we were standing applauding at the end, I turned to her. I'd never thought of it before. I said, it's time to do this about Jack Kennedy.
I saw the YouTube, it looked good.
Thank you. By the next day, I had this vision. And 10 years later, it premiered at the Goodspeed Opera House in Connecticut with the Schuberts producing it.
Awesome.
And I had never thought of it before. I'd written a few song lyrics, but, that was mostly for television shows. And but it was a thrill for a while.
Was it a different mindset when you were writing because it's a play?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was, and especially because it was more than a play. It was meant to being an opera means that it's sung through, and B, it's meant to have an emotional impact deeper than ha-ha. Mm-hmm. I wanted to literally grab the audience by the throat and say, look at what we had and look at what we lost.
Wow.
Because that's the way I feel about John Kennedy.
Yeah.
It was quite an extraordinary experience. Again, just so much luck. I was put together with a composer, lyricist who had some Broadway experience and so on. So he knew some of the players, and one thing led to another.
Being a opera, you just totally have to think in a different tune,
Yeah,
huh?
it was certainly different from the Broadway musical. That was one of the problems once it got into production, because the Broadway people are terrified of touching anybody on an emotional level deeper than laughter. And so I killed the show after a few years. The last production was in Dublin, because I said, unless it is done my way, I will see to it that it's never performed again. And finally, it looks like it's going to get performed again.
As long as we're talking about writing novels.
Well, I turned to novels again. My if I have a philosophy of life, it's or somewhat tastelessly, outside of sex, once I know how to do something, I need more of a challenge. After Murder, She Wrote, it became apparent that I had a few gigs and so on, but I was regarded as a guy in the business who wrote old fart shows. And so I thought, well, I'd love to try novel writing, and so I wrote one. It was a struggle. I mean, it's not easy, but one of the cool things about the form is that you get to live with your characters on a whole other level than you do in television or movies. Get into them much deeper. Mm-hmm. And so that's a fascinating part of it. But I write my novels as if they're movies, and then I, adapt them, the screenplays. A little anecdote about my first novel is Only in Hollywood story. It's called The 16th Man, and the what if is, what if a young archaeologist in Moab, Utah, accidentally opens an ancient burial chamber and finds 16 skeletons. 15 of them are older than anything ever found in the Americas. The 16th has silver fillings in its teeth and a bullet in its wing bone. And when the news comes out, people start getting killed and people start coming out of the woodwork, because it turns out that this 16th man vanished in late 1963 with the answer to who killed Jack Kennedy. right away, a producer glommed it and started shopping it, and I'll never forget the phone call, as I said, an only in Hollywood anecdote. She calls me one day and she says, well, I got great news and bad news from Barry Diller. And I said, okay, give me the great news. She says he loves The 16th Man and he wants to put it into development immediately. And I said, okay, next. And he says he doesn't want it to be about the Kennedy assassination. I mean, where else but in Hollywood?
Yeah, yeah. How important is it to have an agent?
Well, in the entertainment business, you got to have one.
Mm-hmm.
At least to make the deal. I mean, I certainly have done a lot of my own agenting, meeting people and dealing with them one-on-one. But then it's, okay, my people will talk to your people. So that's the way the business works.
But
and
what about unsolicited material?
They're terrified of being sued.
Mm-hmm.
All the years that I was at the studios, every year we would get a letter from the legal department pointing out that if we read anything that came in over the transom, aka without an agent, and the studio got sued, it was on us. Of course, they're fat targets, and some yokel in Iowa writes a script and sends it in, and 2 years later sees one line or a piece of a scene that was in his show, and he can always find a lawyer in Iowa who will go after these large fat targets. So they had a lot of nuisance lawsuits, and so it's understandable. And by the way, about, for instance, breaking into television, one of the best ways to do it is to write several sample scripts that are scripts for shows that are on the air that you have a feeling for. One of the things that agents and studios and showrunners look for is, can a writer capture the voices of the characters in his or her show? That is literally the best. I can't tell you how many scripts I bought and script meetings I took with writers as a result of their agent sending me a sample script. Not necessarily, for instance, for the show I was on, like Murder, She Wrote, but, that gets them in the door. Because if I can see that they can catch the voice of this show or that show as a sample script, the chances are they can do mine.
Yeah.
And so I'm willing to talk to them, and I gave out a lot of assignments that way. One of my favorite examples of that was received a sample script from an agent, 2 women, a writing team, who had just sold their first script. And they wanted to pitch Murder, She Wrote. And so they came in and we sat down to the hello, how are you? I said, so what do you got? And one of them says, a vampire comes to Cabot Cove. And I'm immediately writing it. I'm saying, okay, Jessica Fletcher says, no way there's a vampire. The sheriff says, well, maybe. Or he believes it, and the doc says, well, maybe. So you've got conflict between all your major characters. And of course, conflict is where it's all at. And so I gave him the assignment just based on that.
Wow, how perfect. I've heard that there are some people that have been able to pitch stuff and they didn't have an agent.
Other than, like when I got started with Lila Garrett, yes, that was the case. But that's rare. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say is it's a very tough business to crack without being here, without being in the town.
Yeah, you got to be where it all is happening.
Yeah.
To take the meetings, to talk to me. It really
helps. And again, the socializing. In Hollywood, no matter how many people are at the party, that governs the size of the circle. Because nobody wants to miss anything. And all they talk about is the business.
Yeah. Oh, hey, you writers out there still want to try to pitch your scripts and get them sold? Well, look at Tom. You never know what's going to happen. And if you're one of the gifted ones, it could just happen. So Push like, subscribe to my channel, and remember, always be true to yourself.
I just wanna let you know